What I wanted to do now really was to go on and actually record a sequence from scratch using this program called Vision, which is a sequencer program. It's one of the most recent ones written. One of the reasons that Macintoshes have become so popular among musicians is that there's maybe half a dozen different companies working all at the same time on these kind of programs, and there's no way that a company like Synclavier or Fairlight can compete with half a dozen different Silicon Valley companies all writing the same program. And it's become standardized rather in the same way that word processors have. The chances are if you can work with Write Now or Full Write, you can work with Microsoft Word as well. That's because every time Microsoft Word comes up with a good innovation for word processors, Full Write will include that innovation in their next revision. And the same thing is starting to happen with music software in this way. So the chances are if you can work one music program, you can work another, whereas a Fairlight would take you 3-4 months to learn from scratch. So okay, I'm going to record some stuff here. I'm going to use a song from my first album entitled Wind Power, just because it's a good one really to sort of to demonstrate the different ways in which you use a computer. Okay, when I'm recording this, you're going to actually hear a click. That gives me something to actually play against to keep me in time. And I'm going to put the drums down first. Now, it really varies what sort of order I'll go in. Sometimes I start with like a piano part and then add the drums in later. But if I'm working with a song that is kind of groove-based, that's based on like a hard groove, then I'll generally start with the rhythmic end of things first, because that will, in a way, affect the way that I write the melodies and all of the subsequent parts that I come up with. So I'm going to go in here, and on my first track, I'm going to record the drums. Okay, so that was the drum part. Now, if you take a look at the graphics for that, you'll see all of those notes that I just played actually laid out here on the screen. This stuff down the bottom was all of those bass drums that I was playing. The whole thing was 18 bars long. You see the actual bars across the top here. About every 4 bars I was playing cymbals. These are these notes in here. And once again, all of this stuff is recorded in here, but is destructible. You know, I can mess around, I can save what I did there, and I can change things around just to experiment. If I'd recorded directly onto tape, that wouldn't have been possible. So I'm going to go ahead and record the next part now, which we will make the bass part. Okay, now if you look at these notes on the screen here, see, this is the way the computer thinks of these notes. I can go in and take a look at any of these notes in a finer magnification, like this. And then once again, using the sort of word processing functions, if I wanted, I can mess with those individual notes, or alternatively with entire sections of the piece. Let's suppose, for example, that those 18 bars in there that I showed you, I suppose those first 8 bars there, which is really the verse of what I did, had I decided that, if I listened back to that and started messing around with it, suppose I decided that it was only 8 bars long, but it should really have been 16 bars long. I wanted it to be twice as long. You would approach it with exactly the same way I was earlier on, sort of cloning those individual lines. You just take those 8 bars, make a copy of them, go to the beginning of bar 9, and insert them. And now if you take a look at the overall composition, I've got 16 bars in here of that A section, followed by the B section, which is great. So the next thing that I want to do is record some sort of a melody part. All of this stuff I'm doing quite quickly because I actually wrote the song in 1981. But obviously if you're composing from scratch, there'd be an amount of experimentation went on at this stage. Okay, I'm going to put down a brass part. Okay, now for the next section in there, the B section, just to show you that this sequencer here I can use as I can record any kind of stuff in there, and all I'm really doing is recording the notes. The sounds can be generated by a variety of different devices. So what I'm going to use for the next section is that sample that was it Melissa gave me a little bit earlier on, the Poppadom sample. I can find it.
Poppadom. Poppadom.
Yep.
Poppadom.
Okay. Now I'm going to drop this in at bar 17 because I don't really need to play the first part of it again. And I'm going to give myself a counting of 2 bars.
Poppadom.
Let's turn that up a bit.
Poppadom.
Okay. Okay, Melissa. Alright, just to finish off the end of that little section, I'm going to use that sample from Gothic that I played you earlier on, which is called Byron Death. and I'm going to punch in about bar 25.
Pop it down, pop it down, pop it down, pop it down.
Isn't that amazing?
Papadum, 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 papadum.
Okay. Now, one thing that I should point out is that although I like to compose this way, sort of, it might appear quite mathematically, but this is the language that I grew up with. Different kinds of musicians, like let's say, I don't know, Herbie Hancock or Wynton Marsalis might use this in a very different way, but it still has applications for them, because one of the things that Herbie, for example, could do is he could record 6 different passes of a piano part and go in and edit highlights out of each of them. He's much more of a chops player than I am. He tends not to get so involved in the nitty-gritty sounds and notes of the sequences. He tends to just like call up a sound and just play, which is great. But you know, the way that he would use this kind of a sequence, or maybe be that he would take a solo and actually choose his favourite bits out of it, and it would also again save him an awful lot of studio time. So I'm going to use a sound now. I'm going to use a flute part and go in there and actually improvise over what I've done already, and then I'm going to use the editing capabilities of the computer to actually select bits of what I've played. And I'm going to improvise from the beginning, so it's going to sound like this. Actually, I can switch that off at this point. Now, if you take a look at those notes in there on the flute part, you see there was 3 licks that I played, and there were certain aspects of what I played that I liked, but I didn't like everything about them. So let's just have a listen to those 3 parts and see what we can do to improve them. Okay, now the basic idea of that first lick on the flute I liked. The only problem was that I was playing in the key of B and the song is in the key of F sharp. However, this is something that's very easy for the computer to deal with. You simply take those notes and you transpose them down from B to F sharp. And then you get this. Okay, now that second bit in there, I kind of like, but could have been a little bit more imaginative. So I'm going to mess around with it, but just to be on the safe side, I'm going to make a copy of what I do before I start messing with it. Okay, let's have a go at this. Let's transpose this up by an octave. problem with that was it's a little bit searing up at that volume. So down here I have individual volume parameters for each of those notes in there. So what I'm going to do, one thing I could do here would be to actually pin them all at a low level like this. But then it sort of loses its flutiness, so we'll undo that. Go back to what we had before. And instead I'm going to reduce them, each one of those notes, by a percentage. Let's try about 80. Okay, now if you remember, I still have in memory a copy of the original part that I played. So I'm going to actually paste that back in, keeping the transposed part that I wrote, but I'm going to make it a little bit earlier in the bar. Let's try this. Oops, no, wrong. I should have hit merge. Okay, so I've now got two parts. I've got the original part but played earlier in the bar, and I've got the high transposed part that I put in. Kind of the sound of two rather inebriated flute players working closely together. Okay, let's look at this third riff in here. Well, the idea of a long run I kind of like, but the only problem is that it has the effect of closing the whole thing down, whereas what we want in that B section is for it to open up. So maybe the way to deal with that would be to take these notes here and reverse them. I'm going to move them a little bit in time and move them later by, let's say, a bar. Okay, now let's just go on and magnify these notes a little bit. In fact, I'll tell you what, I'll give it a crescendo over a period of time as well. Let's see. Try this. Now this note at the end in here, I think if I'd played it, instead of playing this B here, I think I would have actually played that as a C sharp. I also would have played it on the beat, and I would have made it a little bit longer, and perhaps in keeping with the style of those earlier riffs there, I would have done a little trail off at the end. So let's take one of these trail offs in here, copy it, go up here, paste it, Okay, now let's have a listen to what we've got. See, everything that I'm doing in here, you know, it's just like out of my imagination, so I can either take it or leave it. If it doesn't sound any good, I can revert to the original. But this is one of the things about electronic music, is that you just really let your imagination run wild and see what you end up with. Not exactly Mozart, but not too bad either. Okay, now, if I've been in the recording studio, the next thing to do after I've got all of my elements in place would be to mix them down in order to enhance them and really make sure that every single sound in there you can hear in the best possible light. And I was showing you earlier on how I was affecting this mixer behind me right from the keyboard. Well, what I can also do with this mixer is when you go into a recording studio, you see those giant mixing boards with thousands and thousands of knobs. All of the functions of those mixers I can now actually do from within the computer. But for example, affecting the tone of a sound, let's call the EQ, you can actually do graphically on a computer, whereas in the studio you can obviously only do it with knobs. And this is a more sort of human way of thinking about the tone of a sound. You can also compress it and put different amounts of effects on, but entirely in the digital domain, which means that you're not adding any noise or degenerating the quality of it at all. So that sequence that I just recorded, if I messed around a little bit with the mix, then I might end up with something like this. Thank you. Now, I see a lot of people getting a little bit nervous here. I'm sure you've got other lectures to go to and important power lunches and stuff like that. So does anybody have any questions that they wanted to ask me? It doesn't have to be on the subject of what you've just seen. It can be anything at all. Yeah. Yeah, okay. All right, well, the question was, he's a violinist, and he was saying that a lot of the violin sounds on keyboards are pretty yucky. So in what ways do I use them when I use them? Well, in the first instance, if I want some serious violin, I'd rather hire you than play around with this machine. But it does have its applications. For example, when I was working with Ken Russell, who is a very musical man, I mean, he knows everything about music, but he's not a musician himself, and he's not used to creating things from scratch himself. When I was working on his film with him, it was very hard for me to play him a melody on the piano and say, yeah, but it's going to sound different when there's a 40-piece orchestra playing it. So one of the ways that I was able to use violin samples was to use the Fairlight, which is probably the best quality, best sounding sampler there is, and use different sections of existing orchestras. Like I sampled lots of stuff off CDs and so on. And using those, I would actually play Ken Russell a closer approximation of how the thing was going to actually sound by the time I'd recorded it with an orchestra. Once he'd okayed it, I actually went into a studio with a real orchestra and recorded it with them. But it was an awful lot easier to give him an idea of how the thing was going to end up using a sampler than it would have been just playing him stuff on a piano. Yeah. Yeah, well, when I first started performing as a solo artist, I used to play as a one-man band, and it was kind of depressing. Everything always went wrong all the time. I used this German computer called a PPG that was originally designed to switch Tangerine Dream's light show on and off, and it was this giant thing the size of a refrigerator, and it tended to sort of spontaneously go up in smoke, you know, rather the way some drummers do. But you know, the good thing about real musicians as against machines when you're playing live is that the audience really have a lot to do with a live performance, because as a musician, when you walk on stage, you're very aware of the atmosphere in a room. If, for example, I come out here with my band and you guys have just come back from, I don't know, a basketball meet and you've been drinking beer for a couple of hours, you'd be sort of gung-ho for the gig, and we'd go screaming into that first number and it would be loud and furious. But on the other hand, if this was a supper club and you just finished off your steak Dianas, then it would be a much more laid-back kind of performance that we would give you. Equally, if one side of the PA goes out in the middle of a performance, musicians will immediately compensate for that. Whereas if you have machines, they only play back in one way. They play back maybe perfectly every time, but they can't respond to the atmosphere in the room. For that reason, in the days when I used to work with machines a lot on stage, I found it very ungratifying. Every night was just a percentage of perfect. You know, some nights would be maybe a 92, last night was maybe an 85. And, you know, but by the time I got home or back to the hotel, I never really felt like I communicated, you know. And I think that's something that's very hard for a band like, let's say, Depeche Mode, who could never play everything that they do live. They're dependent on tapes up to a point, or sequences. It then means that the kind of performance that they do is more like a sort of, it's just more pop in a way, you know. It's just like how he does his twirl or how he shakes his hip is kind of, that's the performance, you know, from night to night. And that's fine for them, but personally I found that the whole of the Flat Earth tour, which I did in 1984 for 6 months, I was doing a sort of hybrid. I was working with live musicians, but we were playing along with sequences. The reason for that was we had video projections going on, we had to stay in sync with them. And at the end of the tour, I didn't really feel like anything had happened, like I'd been out there and played to anybody. So one of the things I like about working with the Lost Toy people nowadays is we use no sequences or drum machines or clicks or anything live. And from night to night, each song is different, you know. Some nights we won't quite nail the tempo, you know, but other nights a certain song will be better than it's ever been before. But one thing is for sure, and that is that the way the audience has a lot to do with the way we perform. And at the end of the day, I prefer it to be that way. You know, I get more gratification from working that way. Yeah. That would have the Mac function as a MIDI brain. You mean to route the pads to different sounds? You mean playing sounds from the Mac? Yeah, you can actually do that with this program that I have, Sound Designer, because the entire package is called Sound Tools, and you can actually store samples within it and play them on different MIDI channels. So you'll be able to use that as a brain for actually playing back your sounds. Yeah. Yeah, I generally try and avoid quantization wherever possible. Quantization, just for those of you who don't know, is a way when you play a part into a sequencer, it's a way of actually making sure that that everything comes out on the beat. You know, for example, if you're a really lousy drummer, you can still record something and have it sound halfway decent. Give you an idea of how we do this. Incredible. Well, anyway. Okay, quantization is basically a means of putting everything on the beat, and the problem with this is that sometimes things end up sounding very mechanical, and that's something you want to avoid. Well, there's different ways of dealing with that. A lot of the new drum machines that are coming out have sort of human element knobs, which you can turn up or down, which will put things sort of off the beat in different ways. But the thing is that drummers actually, what makes them play out of time is that, for example, whenever they play a drum fill, they generally speed up a little bit, and they have to sort of then lag behind afterwards. So in order to accurately recreate the sort of imperfections of a human player, it takes a lot more than just putting things more or less off the beat. So wherever possible, I just avoid it. I just sort of do it by a feel thing. But I think it's very important to have individual access to the placement of those parts before or after the beat. One of the good things about Vision, this sequencer program that I'm using now, is that any instrument that you're messing with, you have what's called shift, and this will actually edge it a few micro beats before or after the beat. And by messing around with that, you can actually change the feel. You can bring a hi-hat earlier, for example, or put a snare drum relative amounts behind. A lot of great groove drummers, if you actually analyse the way they play, it's not at all machine-like. It's very inaccurate, So you should just sort of mess around with the feel that way and use your intuition. Yeah. Why did I move to LA? Well, things are very bad in England at the moment. It's not only economically, but just also morale-wise. And I think people are sort of very elitist about art and about music. And generally the atmosphere over there that I was getting at any point, for any rate, was that because I'm not very sort of tribal about what I do. I don't make post-industrial music, and I don't make heavy metal, and I don't dress a certain way. So you couldn't exactly sort of say, well, I like Dolby and him and them and her. Whereas a lot of people like to say, well, I'm into The Cure and the Banshees and so on, or they say I'm into Guns N' Roses and Def Leppard, and so people are very sort of tribalistic about the kind of music they listen to and the fashion that they wear. And I've always tried to be as much outside any of those trends as I could possibly be. And this makes it very difficult for people to sort of put a finger on me over there, and their attitude to that seems to be, so what makes you so special? What makes you think that you don't need to sound like anybody else? Whereas I find that in America, people sort of applaud individuality, and they say, yeah, what the hell, go for it, when you stick out on your own. And I find that a lot more conducive to good work. The other thing is that because the economy is so bad in England, a lot of my friends who are at the top of their fields, albeit different fields, can't make a living doing what they do. Like my old bass player, who's a brilliant bass player, who's played with all sorts of people, Soft Boys and Robin Hitchcock and the Water Boys and Transvision Vamp and all sorts of different people. He was on the dole for all of last year, and he's just now joining the Pretenders, I think. So after a year of not having any work, he's now going to get some work. But that's very hard to deal with, when people are on Social Security and they're brilliantly talented people. And it was depressing me that I was the only one among my friends that was making a living. So that was one reason that I came here. I only originally planned to come for a year or so, but then I met the woman of my dreams, who is somewhere in the audience tonight, and she's not a patch on you, my dear. Yeah. Okay, well, I don't really listen to any one style of music. There's all sorts of different people that I listen to. I like Kraftwerk, but I don't like Ultravox. I like Van Morrison, but I don't like. You know what I mean. There's no sort of one particular style that I listen to. David Sylvian is a friend of mine I listen to a lot. That sort of access of him and Harushi Sakamoto I'm into. Prince is like a big hero of mine. He kind of is to this generation. I think what David Bowie was to my generation when I was growing up. He's almost like the John McEnroe of music. It doesn't matter how badly the guy behaves, you have to forgive him because what he does is so brilliant. Yeah. Yeah, well, the digitizer is this sort of white box that I've got on the side here. I think the whole package is actually, it's a lot more expensive than some of the stuff I've been working with. It's maybe $2,500 for the whole lot. But it kind of does away with the need for a 2-track tape recorder. It's a way to master all of your stuff down to stereo. And if you've got some sort of storage medium like a hard disk or whatever, then it works great. What kind of equipment do I use? In recording what? Oh, Def Leppard. Oh, sorry. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I did an album with Def Leppard called Pyromania. That was actually about 4 years ago, 5 years ago even. And I don't think actually I used any of this stuff then. I used primarily a Roland JP8 and a Prophet and a Mini Moog, I think. And that was, and a PBG Wave. That was mainly what I worked with. Yeah. No, actually, because really, I mean, nothing that I do is finished until it's finished, if you know what I mean. I mean, at any given point in time, I don't really, it's hard for me to perform anything that I'm doing as I'm going along, because what I'm aiming for is something complete that I can play to people, but it's very rare. I mean, even with my record company, they don't know what I'm doing half the time, where I am, where I'm recording. I'll just walk in one day and dump some tapes on their desk and say, this is the album, release it. Yeah. I don't write charts, no, because I don't really read or write music in that way, and I think some of them do, and they might make their own forms of notation. But I just tend to give things to them just a few notes at a time and sort of build it up from that way. As far as something coming out, I probably won't be recording my next album until the late summer. I have a couple of things to do first. I'm going to be working with an Israeli singer called Ofra Haza, and writing and recording a couple of songs with her in the next few weeks. I also have to finish off the theme music for ABC's fall preview. And then after that I'm going back to England and I'm going to be producing the next album for Prefab Sprout. Thanks. And then after that I'll get into my own album, so it probably won't be, it'll be like January or February before my next album is out. Yeah. I could use somebody to clean out the hot tub. But no, actually, maybe if you get in touch with my assistant Mary, who'll be sort of hanging around afterwards, you give her details. But I'd certainly talk to you about it. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah, well, Bruce Woolley and Trevor Horn are sort of two very different kettles of fish, actually. Trevor, I did work with Trevor Horn on the Malcolm McLaren album, Duck Rock, and while I think he's a brilliant man and a brilliant producer, he doesn't, he's kind of a little bit tough for me, he tends to sort of be, well, there's the charts and nothing else, it's like that's the only way to go, and he would never do anything if it wasn't sort of commercial with a capital C. And I tend to be very selfish about what I do. Some of what I do, I know that it's not going to reach a wide audience. But I tend not to make decisions based on my career or my bank book or anything like that. I tend to, although that's a consideration, but I'm more really motivated by how I'm going to enjoy spending the month of May. Right now I'm in a mood to go and work with Prefab Sprout, so that's what I'll do. But from a pure industry point of view, I'd probably be better off staying here and getting another album out in the fall, and so capitalizing on the impetus that I built up with the last album So yeah, I don't think I would work with Trevor Horn because we don't really see eye to eye in that way. Yeah. Okay, do I write lyrics first or music first? Well, there's no strict rule to it. Like that song Mood of the Rainforest that I wrote, it was the words and music sort of came in dribs and drabs as I was going on. Lyrics are usually the last thing that I will complete because I'm not a natural poet. I have to work quite hard at it. And I end up writing things. I'll go out and I'll start doing the vocal even though I've got only maybe one verse of lyrics written. And then I'll sort of do it like stream of consciousness or whatever, and maybe write a couple of lines and come back the next day and finish them off. So there's no strict rule to it. There can be all sorts of different ways. Sometimes I just work at the piano. I like the simplicity of just sitting down at the piano and working at that. Yeah. I think it's really hard sometimes to separate the different motives for people to write certain kind of music. Some of them are business considerations. Some of them are like an artist will write a song and he'll think, well, in order to get this on the radio, I have to make it danceable. And some of them are that the kind of people writing music now are a certain generation, and they're going to write music in a certain way. The way you get a movement in any of the arts, there is a movement, and that's the way people are sort of naturally coming up with stuff. I'm not sure if I'm explaining that very well, but I'm conscious of pressures when I sit down to write stuff, but I don't get like pressure from the record company to conform to anything. All I know is that when I listen to the radio, I sort of tend to go, well, I can do better than that. It's not very hard these days to do better than that, but I mean, so for that reason, when I sit down, I'll try and do something which up to a point conforms with stuff that's out there, competes with stuff that's out there, but also has my own individuality stamped on it. Yeah. No, as I said, that sampler, those samples in there were using up about 40 meg of the hard disk. The sequence I just wrote was probably about 500k or something like that, so relatively speaking, notes are very, very few. A lot of people are sort of drifting off, so I'll take a couple more questions and then call it a day. Yeah. Am I going to play around soon? Oh, you mean playing live? Yeah. I would say not till after the next album comes out. Yeah. Anybody particular in mind? I was really talking to myself. Another John McEnroe is in there. Yeah. Right. Well, that's really hard to say. Just the ethics of sort of doing stuff for business reasons rather than, whatever takes your fancy. It's hard to say. I like to be stretched when I work with somebody else. Foreigner or Def Leppard or Belinda Carlisle, it's all very different music to my own, but I like that. I like the fact that I get in the studio and I'm nervous because I wonder if I'm going to be able to find an aspect to my playing that will be compatible with these people, so I like to mess around a lot with that. Every now and then there'll be something that's more of a sort of heartfelt thing, like working with Prefab Sprout or Joni Mitchell, or that all is sort of music that is quite close to my heart, so it's very different from the sort of outwardness of doing something with one of those other people. Last question. Yeah. Lena Lovitch is in Norfolk, England. She has 2 babies now, or 2 kids now, and she's planning to make a comeback. Okay, well, you've been a great audience. Thanks very much. Thank you.